All right, we're going to give a chance for people to join. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Tommy, you want to start? Or you want me to start?
Congressman, I think you should start, but let's give it just another minute for folks to pile in.
You tell me. You guys give me to go ahead. But welcome,
that sounds
everybody.
Great. Once the participant starts to level off, we can give it a go, Congressman.
I got a good crowd.
Yeah. I think you can probably get started, sir.
All right. Well, welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar, and glad to be with you. We're joined with folks from my team, Tommy Brown, who's going to lead the conversation this morning, but also off camera, Robert Perez, who you probably got the invitation from and they helped organizing it, Matt Freed, my communications director, and calling in from vacation, Greg Claus. Thank you for joining us, my deputy chief and district director, you all know well. So we're here to talk about community project funding. This was a process that was initiated last year, and it gives all members of Congress, including me, the chance to advocate for the highest priority projects within our district. And it was something that I think most of my colleagues found very much a challenging process, but also a process that gave us the chance to do what we do. People like to say, Speaker Pelosi says, our job description and our job title are the same single word, representative. And nobody knows the 10th District of Illinois in Congress, or should know the 10th District of Illinois in Congress or the federal government than I and my team. So that's what this process is about. Last year, when we kicked it off, we had more than 60 applications submitted. We were allowed to advocate on behalf of 10, which we did. We wanted to make sure we got as many as we could. And I know the team worked tirelessly to collect information for those projects last spring. We presented them to the appropriations process. And over the course of, what should have been 6 months or less, the goal is to have the appropriations bills completed and signed into law before the beginning of the fiscal year, which is October 1st of last year. This year, the process took a bit longer, and it wasn't until this month that the Senate and House finally were able to get there. But the good news is, and in all seriousness, to our pleasant surprise, we got funding for all 10 of our projects that we advocated for. We were very proud of that. And among these were an expansion of our resources for the Northern Illinois Food Bank to expand and add a distribution center, a workforce development program at the College of Lake County, expansion of mental health facilities, resources for this with Lake County Health Department, projects for economic development in Mundelein, infrastructure in Prospect Heights, emergency services across the county, across Lake County, flood control, flood prevention in Zion, North Chicago, and Waukegan, and economic development in downtown Waukegan. So like I said, we were very pleased that we were able to get at least some funding for all these projects. The good news is that the process was deemed successful enough in general that this year we're allowed to advocate for 15, and our intention is to try to identify 15 projects on which we'll advocate. As we said last year, the expectation was not to get all 15, or last year all 10 funded. We were thrilled that we were able to do it, and knock wood, maybe we can do that again. But that's my goal, is to do what we can to advocate for the projects within the community. Let me talk about a little bit about the process from a high level, and then Tommy will go into it in much more detail. But at the highest level, it is a process, and there are rules, appropriately so, because we should have transparency and people seeing what we're doing. And as part of the appropriations process, there's 12 bills in theory. Normally it's an omnibus, but there are categories. It's critically important, and I can't overstate this, that any application or project submitted for consideration is eligible for an account within the process which you're applying. Tommy's going to explain more detail what that means, and there's guidance on our website, and more guidance will be coming. But our challenge is to always make sure that we are putting round pegs into round holes, square pegs into square holes, and not letting it not having an issue because we didn't follow the process itself. Bottom line is, if you're not eligible for an account and you're asking for money in an ineligible expense, the process is going to kick it out, and it will affect our abilities to advocate. So unless Greg or Tommy tells me that I've missed anything, I think that covers it. And I'm going to turn it over to you guys. I'm going to bid adieu to the group. Thank you. You're in good hands. I actually have a hearing here in Washington, so I'm going to return to my hearing. But I am excited about this process. I'm excited about the success we had with fiscal year 2022 and the impact we're having on our community. I look forward to talking to you all soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Congressman. Great. So we are going to get started. Robert, if you want to cue up the PowerPoint. Excellent. So a couple things that I want to say on the front end. First of all, we learned a lot from the process last year, and we hope that we can make our process for taking in CPF requests and helping all of you in applying. We hope that process can improve the second time around. Second of all, there's a lot that we know, but there's also at this stage in the process a lot that we don't know. And so today we are hoping to provide you all the information that we have right now. And then over the next few days, we will have some updates about some of the new accounts that will be available for fiscal year 2023. And the last thing I'll say is, if you have questions, don't feel like this is the only opportunity to address them. All the information that I'm going to be covering today during the webinar is on our website, schneider.house.gov/appropriations. And that link will be throughout the PowerPoint, so don't feel compelled to write it down now. All of that information is on the website. And at the end of the presentation, we'll give you our contact information. Our goal here is to help you all as much as possible to provide compelling projects that help the community. So we are your resource throughout this process. But as I said, there's a lot of stuff we do know, but there's also a lot of stuff we don't know at this process. So we appreciate your patience as we navigate this. Before diving into specifics on the community project funding process, I think it's helpful to give a broad overview of the two major things that Congress does in the appropriations process. So appropriations direct all federal spending. Every penny that the federal government spends is through direct appropriation by Congress. When you hear the phrase Congress holds the purse strings, that's what that means. Appropriations are generally comprised of mandatory funding, things like Social Security, Medicare, payment on the national debt, and discretionary funding. And we pass bills annually that divides up how that discretionary funding is spent. Last year, as the congressman noted, was the first year for the community funding, project funding process. In years past, this has been referred to earmarks, but that process was put on pause for about a decade, and we're really excited to have it back, because I think as you heard the projects we funded last year, it can have a great impact on our community. Next slide. So in terms of those two different parts of the appropriations process, I want to briefly talk about account specific, but that's not really the topic of the presentation today. We're going to be focusing on project specific funding under the community project funding process. But I do briefly want to talk about account specific requests, because some stakeholders do submit those requests throughout the year. Each fiscal year, members of Congress will solicit input and priorities from folks back in the district on what federal programs they use the most. These are, again, not project specific. This is arguing for the top line funding amount for a given account. So a couple examples from our community. One would be Impact Aid, which is a Department of Defense program that helps schools like Forrestal Elementary in North Chicago that are connected with a military base. So advocating for more funding for Impact Aid. or TFAP, the Emergency Food Assistance Program, helps food banks around the country. And so we often hear from food banks in our area advocating for more funding for that program because it helps them fulfill their mission. When they're advocating for that funding, it's not specific amount for them, it's the top number for how much that account has. AFG and SAFER grants are used by fire departments around the district. And so we hear from fire chiefs about how important that funding is, as well as GLRI, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. All accounts that we advocate for more funding. But again, this is just about how much money is in that pot. And that is not the community project funding process. If you do have, next slide, please. If you do have an account specific request, we will email all of the participants in this webinar the form we use for processing those. And it includes my contact information. So if you do have questions, please let me know. But again, that is separate from the CPF process. But I did want to make sure to cover it since a lot of our stakeholders back in the district do have questions on that. Next slide, please. So what we're going to focus on today is project-specific requests. As I said, last year was the first year of the community project funding, the CPF process. Last year, each member submitted to the House Appropriations Committee a maximum of 10 projects. We received, Greg, correct me if I'm wrong, I think somewhere north of 60 submissions. Yep, and worked with stakeholders in the district on vetting those and whittling it down to 10 that we submitted to the House Appropriations Committee. And I'll say this multiple times, but each CPF submission has to fit the eligibility requirements of the account to which they're applying. Just like the congressman said, we need to make sure we're putting our round pegs in round holes. If your submission does not fit the eligibility requirements of the account you're applying to, we're not in a position to help advance that project because each of those accounts have specific eligibility criteria. Next slide, please. The congressman walked through the different projects that we secured, but here's a list of those. Things like flood mitigation in high need communities, things like economic development, workforce development and training, helping resources in our community like the Northern Illinois Food Bank. And all of these projects have something in common. They fit the eligibility criteria of the account, but they also benefit our community. And they have a significant community-wide benefit and mission. So as we go, well, we'll talk about what makes for a compelling project a little bit later, but if we can go to the next slide. And again, all this information is on the website. And so if you do need to refer back to it, that's your place to go. But here, I think, are the most important dates in our process. And you'll notice, unfortunately, it is a very quick turnaround. Unfortunately, that is a product of how this process works. But on April 4th, the new CPF accounts are going to be posted on our website. We have already listed the accounts from last year, most of which we expect to be eligible this year. So that gives you some guidance on the different eligible accounts for funding, but we will have the full list up by Monday. On Tuesday, our applications will open. We're also going to hold a second webinar where we'll walk through all this stuff that we're talking about today, but also the new accounts that are eligible. You'll have 8 days to submit your applications. Obviously that is a breakneck turnaround. But as you'll see, as we go through more of the presentation, the CPF process is not really an opportunity for new ideas. It is an opportunity for projects that you have already fleshed out that are part of your strategic plan or that are so-called shovel ready. So ideally, you are not building your application completely from scratch. But also the timeline is a reflection on just the process overall and how it fits into the broader appropriations timeline. So we regret that it is such a quick turnaround, but hopefully you already have most of the information you need on hand for your application. After the 13th, when all of these are due, we will have about 2 weeks where the office staff will interview with the applicants, follow up on different questions, flesh out different answers, make sure that you guys fit the eligibility criteria, make sure that you guys have things like letters of support to demonstrate community support. And then our aim is April 29th, we will be announcing all the finalists and non-finalists. April 29th is not when that process ends, though. That is just when we submit those projects to the House Appropriations Committee. The Appropriations Committee will have its own vetting process after the 29th, and will include the projects that it has vetted and approved in the final funding legislation. Then it needs to vote that legislation out of committee. Then we need to pass it on the floor of the House. And then that legislation needs to pass the Senate and get signed by the president. So even once we hit submit to all of our projects later in April, that is only step, say, 4 of a 27-step process. And so I think one of the biggest things we ask of those finalists who did secure a submission, just patience, because so much of this process is outside of our control and subject to other steps. Next slide, please.
And if I could just chime in, unfortunately, just to echo what Tommy said, this is not a timeline that's decided by us. We understand how tight this is, and we would love for it to be longer because I know it's a huge burden on communities and organizations to put the application together so quickly. But it is part of the appropriations process, which is DC set. So this is a deadline basically everyone in the country, all the members in the country are following. And unfortunately, just again, to echo what Tommy said, this is a bit of a hurry up and wait. We submitted our applications last year, and it, we found out rather quickly, within a month or two that they were included in the bill, but it took a full year for that bill to make its way through the House and then the Senate and then to the president's desk, with many ups and downs and nail-biting moments along the way. So unfortunately, that is also what's in store for us this year.
The one bit of good news this year, though, is last year we were uncertain if this process would actually come to fruition and if we would actually be able to pass all of these projects. And our hope is, since we were able to do that last year, that sets the precedent for continuing to do this process annually. We don't know of the 15 projects that we will submit for this fiscal year. We do not know if they will fund all of them, 2 of them, 7 of them. That is completely outside of our control. But our hope is that the process will continue, set by the precedent from last year. All right, so as I said, your one-stop shop as you have questions is on our website, schneider.house.gov/appropriations. All the information that we're covering today is on that website. That includes your timelines and deadlines that everyone will need to be following. That includes a full list of the awardees from last year to give you some sense of what types of projects we found compelling and we prioritized. It also gives a walkthrough of best practices, which I'll go over in a little bit, for what makes a very compelling submission. Chris, to your question, will these slides be posted as well? We'll make sure to get those on the website as well. And then it will, the website also includes information about what accounts were funded last year. We know that there will be more accounts than that funded this year, but it's a good place for you all to start as you look for which initiatives fit your projects. And then, as I said, once it's released by the House Appropriations Committee, we will also have guidance on all of the accounts for next year and all the details on the respective eligibility. Next slide, please. You'll hear this theme time and time again, but eligibility is, I think, #1 variable to keep in mind as you're looking at your projects. Only government entities and nonprofit organizations located in our congressional district are eligible. For-profit organizations are not eligible for CPF funding. And if you're a 501c3 organization, you are absolutely eligible, and you'll probably need to provide your EIN. There is some eligibility for other forms of nonprofits. For instance, 501c6 organizations like local chambers of commerce are eligible, but other types of 501c6s, like a professional sports team, are not necessarily eligible. So if you have a question about your nonprofit's eligibility, feel free to just give me a call. I might not know the answer, but I can promise you that I'll get you an answer. Local match for a lot of these accounts, but not all of them. A lot of them require some level of local match. So as part of the process, making sure that you know whether or not there is a local match requirement and making sure you can demonstrate that local match is an important part of the process. The next bullet, multi-year funding is not eligible. All projects must be 1 year funding. What that means is, let's say you are applying in order to fund a new program at a community college. The funding you're receiving is going to go towards 1 fiscal year's worth of funding. You're not going to be able to come back year after year after year to secure ongoing long-term funding for that program. The best way to think of it is think of it as a lump sum that you will receive this fiscal year. It is not a continual source of funding. This makes a lot of sense with capital projects. Obviously, it's a one-time fund, but with programming, it can get a little bit more confusing. But think of this as 1 year funding. And if you have questions about that, we can address those towards the end. And the last part is all final submissions are going to be publicly disclosed. And so just knowing that we will always be leaning towards transparency and disclosure throughout this process. And so please keep that in mind. Next slide, please. This touches on a lot of what I said earlier, but again, for-profit organizations are not eligible for CPF funding. This year, we are also limiting the number of submissions different entities can submit. Multi-jurisdictional governments can submit 6 projects, and all other entities, whether local governments, law enforcement agencies, nonprofits, school districts, all other entities can submit 3 projects. Applicants who submit multiple projects we're going to ask that you prioritize your submissions so that we have a good idea of which are most important to you. It's also worth noting that CPF funding is not fungible and it has to go towards the application's expense. You cannot take federal funding away from the capital expense that you applied for and apply it to some programming or servicing of debt or salaries or what have you. The funds have to go towards their designated purpose. There's going to be auditing and transparency throughout this process. And so we need to make that point very upfront. With 2 exceptions, most accounts do not allow for capital expenditures or facility renovation. Those exceptions are listed below. There's one account within Health and Human Services, and there's one account within Housing and Urban Development. So there are opportunities for capital expenditures. Most of the funding goes towards programming, but all that is to say, depending on the type of project you're submitting, please make sure that the funds you are asking for are towards an eligible expense. So if it is a capital expense, make sure that the account you're applying to allows for capital expenditures. Next slide, please.
And one more thing, Tommy.
Please.
It's also not we cannot use these funds for reimbursement. So no expenses can be incurred on the project. It has to be waiting until it gets funded. And then once it's funded, there's a process for drawing down those funds, and then you can enact that. But none of this can be for reimbursement.
Exactly. Thanks for pointing that out, Greg, because that's a really important point. We learned a lot from our CPF process last year, and we wanted to relay what we learned so that you guys can put together the most compelling applications possible. And I think those best practices fell into kind of 4 different buckets. The first is you need to demonstrate both the impact of the project and its readiness. So as you saw with the projects that we funded last year, most of them had a community-wide impact, or they served a high-need population, or they addressed a long-recognized local priority. And that is a story that all of you are going to need to tell succinctly and demonstrate why that project is needed. But what's also helpful to keep in mind is while you guys live your mission every single day within your organizations, it is helpful to us if you put that project into context, into the context of your needs, your organization's history, your organization's mission. Help tell us the story about why the project is needed, and where it fits into your broader picture. Like I said, it helps to demonstrate how the project fits within your long-term planning. So a couple examples of where you can demonstrate that: if you have a strategic plan that you have that lists, this project and makes it clear that you've been thinking about this need for a long time. For local governments pursuing things like infrastructure investment, demonstrating that you already have an intergovernmental agreement, or that this city council passed a resolution in support of the project. Anything you can do to demonstrate the level of depth of thought you put into the project is helpful. And as I said earlier on, CPF proposals, it's not the best opportunity for new ideas. The best applications, again, are for well-established projects. So item number 2 is, and we'll say this 17 more times, applications must be an eligible entity, and they must fulfill the account-specific eligibility requirements. All of those are spelled out on the website, and you'll get more information as we get more information. But 2 brief examples. One of the most popular submissions we got last year was a Department of Homeland Security program called pre-disaster mitigation grants. These generally help with stormwater management and prevent flooding and what have you. That one program required that the applicant had to be a government entity. It required a local match, and it also required a letter of support from the Illinois Emergency Management Agency. So those are just examples of the specific account-specific requirements you might have to be thinking about. Another was the Department of Transportation accounts for local transportation priorities, another area where we successfully funded some projects. The applicant had to be a government entity, and it had to be included in the State Transportation Improvement Plan, or CMAP's Transportation Improvement Plan. That is to say, you had to demonstrate that this project had already been vetted and verified by the relevant state government agency. Next slide, please. The next item that you really need to be thinking about is how you demonstrate community support. So you need to demonstrate among relevant stakeholders like impacted organizations. You need to show the history of the project, or that it is listed in planning documents or has support from a city council resolution or what have you. A good example here is one of the projects we funded last year was a flood mitigation project in an area called Dady Slough. And they, in their application, Lake County provided letters of support from Park City, from the Illinois Emergency Management Agency, from the East Skokie Drainage District, from Cristo Rey Preparatory Academy, which would benefit from the lack of flooding in that area. So you don't need to do it now in your process, but if as you go through your application, start developing a list of who you think can speak in support of the project, either through a letter of support or if there are press articles highlighting the need for the project. But we want you thinking about how you can demonstrate, again, that the proposal you're submitting has strong community support, because that is a really important variable. And then the last bit, as I mentioned, some accounts require a local match, some don't. So definitely be aware of whether or not there is a requirement. If there is a local match requirement, you don't have to have the funding on hand right now, but you do need to demonstrate how you would be able to fulfill that match. There's definitely a wariness among the Appropriations Committee of approving projects that will require regular funding, renewed funding each and every year. So we really should be thinking about these proposals as one-year funding, a lump sum that goes towards one specific purpose, not a continual renewal of funding. Next slide, please. So as I said at the beginning, we have a lot of information, but we don't have all the information. So until our application process opens on Tuesday of next week, the things you can be doing now to prepare your application. One is get yourself familiar with the different available accounts. Again, all that information is on our website, schneider.house.gov/appropriations. This walks you through the different opportunities for funding and what those eligibility requirements are. Once we release the new information on the new accounts, which I hope it will definitely be posted by Monday. My hope is to get it posted by the end of the day tomorrow. Definitely spend some time looking at those new accounts and see where those opportunities are, where it fits within your planning. Identify good shovel-ready projects. Don't try and reinvent the wheel with your proposal. We included on the website links to PDFs of all the different applications from last year. The different forms, not what people submitted. And so that helps you understand the types of questions we'll be asking and the types of information we'll need you to provide in order to put forth a compelling submission. And then, as I said, also just start thinking about a list of supporters and how you're going to demonstrate that community support. As I said, the application portal will open on April 5th, which is next Tuesday. Next slide, please. Once the application portal is open, obviously review all the accounts, including the new ones for FY23, and determine which account makes the most sense for your submission. Item 2, confirm that the project you're applying for is eligible for the funds you're looking to get. Again, this is about finding round pegs for round holes. And then the last thing I'd say is prepare your submission in a separate document, like a Word doc or even an email, just so that you have it housed in a space that isn't the application portal. The last thing we want you to do is spend an hour plugging in all the information and then have to hit back or something happens with the submission portal. I think building your application in a separate document, make sure that you can get all of your questions answered before you start plugging in that information. Hope that makes sense. All submissions are going to be due April 13th, which is not this coming Wednesday, but the following. Next slide. After you hit submit on your CPF requests, hopefully before the 13th, but certainly by the 13th, we will spend the next 2 weeks reviewing applications, interviewing with applicants, doing our due diligence and vetting those different projects. We expect to have a conversation with every single applicant. And so in those conversations, you should be prepared to talk through your project, why it's needed, how it fits within the eligibility parameters, the history of the project. Again, try and put it into a context that helps us understand why it's needed. We will be getting final answers to folks for what we will submit by April 29th. We then submit those projects to the House Appropriations Committee. The committee spends the next 2 weeks after that vetting those projects on their own, and then puts them into the legislation that the committee then marks up and sends to the House floor. The House passes, the Senate passes, and then hopefully the president signs. But again, remember that even once we hit submit on our submissions to the House Appropriations Committee, there's still a long timeline of things that have to happen before we're able to secure your funding. I think in terms of expectations, if you are a finalist, and it is included in what the House Appropriations Committee passes, and that eventually gets signed into law, I think you can probably expect to see federal funding sometime around next summer, so summer 2023. Our hope is that that timeline works a little faster, but again, so many of these parts of the process are outside our control. Last slide, please. So additional questions. This is my contact information and Greg's contact information. I think as you have questions, again, our hope is that first step is to check out the website. We have a lot of information on there that you guys can make use of. We have about 25 minutes now to address your questions. So what I think I'd like to do is just go through the questions in the chat. Once we go through all of those, if you can use the raise hand feature, and we'll go through each question as they have it. So to Chris's question, we will be posting the slides on the website. To Michael's question on whether or not school districts are eligible, yep, school districts are eligible to submit CPFs. To Kevin's question, I did not see nonprofit organizations get grants last year. Is there a higher bar for nonprofits, or did not many apply? So there were several nonprofits that secured funding. The one that comes to mind is Northern Illinois Food Bank, but nonprofits don't have any higher bar, but there are some accounts that require government entities to apply. But we are processing submissions from nonprofits in the same exact manner as we are others.
And Tammy,
Kenneth?
I want to go back
Yep.
to Kevin Harvey. I don't know if you answered this one. Are the accounts for the FY 2023 funded already determined and fixed? And yep.
Yes, so they have been determined and fixed, and they're being released by the Appropriations Committee shortly. And so, unfortunately, that is not something that we have a role in determining, but that information should be coming out. And as I said, my hope is to post that information on the website tomorrow at the latest Monday to provide you information about what new accounts are eligible.
Kenneth Robinson asked about park districts being eligible for the CPF funds.
Yes, park districts are eligible entities.
And just to reiterate Tommy's earlier point, you do have to figure out exactly which account you're looking to get your funds from. So if, for example, there's a major flooding issue, you can get it through that pre-disaster mitigation fund through FEMA, and you can do water restoration initiatives. There's, that could be park related. There could be some transportation alternatives if you're looking to do bike path or jogging trail for the parks. You do have to look exactly at which account it is and figure out your project that's going to fit with that account. And I know we keep reiterating this a lot because the problem is there's a lot of really great project ideas, but it has to fit in one of the accounts that's already there. And if it is a great idea, but it doesn't fit with one of the project accounts, then unfortunately, we can't move the project forward.
And that's the eligibility criteria is not something we determine. And the committee is only going to consider proposals that fit within the criteria of that the eligibility for each account. So again, unfortunately, that's just out of our hands.
Marcia asked, can government funded money for the same project be allowed as a match?
Yes. So the local match, it doesn't necessarily matter where that funding is coming from. So let's say a local government is using state funds to provide for the local match, that is allowable. But if that is something that you plan on doing, let's have a conversation about it during the application process, because we want to make clear that you all have funding aside for the local match, even if the applying entity is not the one providing that funding.
Catherine asked, if project funds are not for reimbursement, when would the funds be released?
Again, our hope is that you'll have access to the funds by next summer. But because so many steps in that process are undetermined or outside of our control, it's difficult for us to predict exactly. But I think as the FY22 money gets dispersed, I think that'll give us a sense of what timeline to expect for next year. We signed the omnibus legislation that included these projects in mid-March, and our hope is that that funding will be made available sometime this summer. And so if we follow that same timeline, FY23 projects will have access to their funding by next summer. But again, there is a certain degree of uncertainty in determining that.
Mike Brown asked, is fire station remodeling eligible?
It is possible that fire stations can apply for those sorts of funds under one of the new accounts, but under the existing accounts from FY22, that would not be an eligible expense. But Mike, let's have a conversation offline and we can talk through what opportunities there are for fire stations.
And I think we've heard from a variety of first responder organizations. Tommy, could you talk about the Lake County Emergency 911 Center that was funded last time and how that works?
Yeah. So Lake County is working to create a consolidated emergency operations center, and emergency operations center funding is an eligible account under the Department of Homeland Security. And so we were able to secure them, Greg, I think about $1 million towards that construction. And so we didn't get them all the funds that they asked for. And it had to go towards that construction of the emergency operations center, but we were able to offset some of the costs. And so it's an important point to hammer home is even if you're asking for a specific amount, most of our projects were funded at the requested amount, but not all of them. And so I think just be prepared for, if you are able to secure funding, it might not be every bit of funding you need, but our hope is most of them will be fully funded.
Yeah, I think we tried to get 10 million for that project and then they cut it down to 1 million. They told
Yeah.
us that that's the most they could do.
Yep. Every EOC grant from that process was capped at $1 million. And the accounts this year, we expect there will be a funding cap, but a lot of that information is still forthcoming.
All right, Nicole asked, is funding direct from federal government or through an Illinois agency? That's a great question.
Yeah, so for the CPF process, it is directly from the federal government. There are other obviously grant programs that flow through the state. That is part of the broader appropriations process. But for the purpose of this discussion, for CPF projects, it'll be coming directly from the federal government.
Michael asked, no money can be spent until after appropriations, correct? If it is spent before appropriations, no reimbursement, correct?
Correct.
For both of those, that's right. Yep.
Yep.
Mike asked, fire apparatus acquisition, is that eligible?
So there are two grant programs that fire departments have access to, AFG, Assistance for Firefighter Grants, and SAFER, which AFG goes towards equipment, SAFER goes towards training. I believe that those grants will be an eligible account this year. And so, Mike, let's have a conversation about how we can have you guys apply to those accounts. As I get more information, I'll be posting it on the website. But let's definitely set aside some time to talk through where those opportunities are.
Yep. Brooke asks, are each accounts required also included on your website, or is there a separate piece we need to visit to view their requirements?
So all the requirements for the accounts are listed on the website, and there will be more information forthcoming, but they should give you an idea of what is required for each account.
Nicole asked, does federal QBS apply for consultation selection to be eligible for grant reimbursement?
So Nicole, unfortunately, I'm not familiar with QBS, but I encourage you to shoot me an email and we can talk through the question you have.
QBS, actually, I don't know that one. Consultant selection, sorry, I said that wrong. Can you help us, Liz asked, can you help us understand the ideal budget and staffing requirement on the nonprofit side as an applicant? Most of the items I saw last year were almost $1 million. Is that not appropriate for smaller organizations on budgets?
So feel free to apply for smaller amounts than $1 million. And our goal here is to help all applicants at every step of the process as they prepare their submissions. And so if you have a smaller project that is well under $1 million, I strongly encourage you to apply. Do not look at the funding amounts from last year as the only way forward. So smaller organizations strongly encourage you to apply for whatever funding amount fits your project. Obviously, as we get towards the higher end of things, there are caps on larger amounts, but don't be discouraged from requesting smaller amounts.
Father Corey asked, are the accounts posted on the website yet, or are they not?
So the accounts that we used last year are all posted on the website. I believe all but one of those accounts will be eligible this year. In addition to those accounts, we will soon be posting the new accounts for this year. And so you'll see some additions, hopefully not any subtractions to what is listed on the website. But what is on there currently are accounts from last year that we expect to be made eligible this year. And it gives you a good place to start. We only have so much of the information and guidance. So we're trying to give you as much guidance as we have on hand. But Father Corey, I encourage you to reach out if you have questions about specific accounts.
John asked, would, in addition to provide accessibility to an existing structure, such as a playground, be allowed?
So I
definitely, yes.
Yeah, no, definitely understand the question. I think we'll need to look at the requirements for specific accounts. But John, definitely take a look at what we have listed so far. And as we get more information about the new accounts, I think we can talk through where those opportunities are. I don't know offhand, but I think we can probably find a place where that would be eligible. But let's start by looking at the accounts that are listed.
And just to reiterate, once the accounts are announced next week, April 1st, and our application is live, we will again be blasting it out on our grant newsletter list, which is where probably most everyone got this invitation today. And we'll say exactly what the accounts are and that the application's live. So you'll hear from us by email. Sadaf asked if the funds are expected to be released by next summer. Is there a timeline to spend these funds since it is for fiscal year 2023?
So the phrase 1 year funding is definitely confusing. You don't have to spend it within a year, but it comes from one fiscal year's appropriation bill. So to your question, is there a timeline to spend those funds? Yes, but it's a long timeline. And so I think those will depend on the accounts, and I can try and get you more information, Sadaf, but I don't think you feel the need to spend it within a very short period of time. It's obviously going to depend on what the project is. Yeah, I understand how the phrase 1 year funding can be a little confusing in terms of the constraints in spending that money.
Catherine asked, do you anticipate seeing any cultural history or art accounts?
Short answer is I don't know. I certainly hope so. I think for cultural history or art projects, the degree to which you can connect those to local economic development, I think really helps for making a compelling application. One of the projects we funded last year was renovation of the Waukegan Carnegie Library, which is definitely a cultural space, but they applied through the Economic Development Initiative account because of the economic impact that library renovation would have in downtown Waukegan. And so the degree to which you can connect that story to things like economic development, I think is helpful.
Pastor Roberson asks, are building construction projects eligible?
So there are capital expenditures like construction eligible within certain accounts, but not every account allows for construction funding. So as you're looking at the different accounts, it should be clear which allow for capital expenditures and which don't. But if you have any questions, please feel free to be in touch.
Debbie asked, if we have a portion of the funding for a project saved in our account, will that impact our ability to request for the full quote?
No, I think if you already have some funding set aside for a project and we're able to secure the full amount for the project, I think you're certainly allowed to use that savings elsewhere. But it's obviously going to really depend on a case-by-case basis.
And Joan asked this, and I know Carmen has also asked me this as well. Are library expansion projects eligible?
So again, certain accounts allow for capital expenditures. One of those is the Economic Development Initiative. Some of the new accounts might. And so I think as you look at the different accounts, seeing whether or not capital expenditures are an allowable use of funds is something you should be looking at.
Okay, and Nicole responded back about, does federal QBS apply for consultant selection to be eligible for grant reimbursement? So I think she's asking, can grant consultant selection be part of the project costs, and would that be, getting the application developed, the pre-qualification stuff, does that count for the actual project? If I'm understanding the question correctly.
I don't think so, because as with all expenses, these funds cannot be used to reimburse. And so if you use a consultant to develop an application, I don't believe the payment towards that consultant is an eligible expense because you've already spent it, and it would thus be a reimbursement. But Nicole, feel free to give me a call and we can talk this through.
Michael asked a great clarifying question. Is appropriation when the project is approved, or is appropriation when money is released?
Great question. I would say appropriation is when the bill is signed into law, because that locks in the process for dispersing the funds and where the funds can be used. So the disbursement of money is a separate step in the process. I think the appropriation is when the funding bill, spending bill is signed into law.
Robert asks, could money be used for a local incident command center at a police department?
I believe so. Yes, that should be an eligible expense under the Emergency Operations Center grant program, which is capped at $1 million. But we were successful in securing some of those funds last time. And so, Robert, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.
And definitely check out the application that Lake County submitted last year for their 911 center. That's on our website, and it would be a great starting place for developing a strong application. And Jero asked, would the construction of a new water well and well house in a community be eligible?
I believe so. Jero, let's talk once the new accounts are released to make sure before you start to put together your application. We received some water wells applications last time, and I need to refresh my memory on which account they applied under. But the short answer is I'm pretty sure. But let's talk offline once the new accounts are released, and we can get you a firm answer.
I think, and don't quote me on this, but I believe it was EPA. There's a few accounts there for water, and then also
yes, I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's right.
There's a lot of water issues in our district, both drinking water and stormwater. For stormwater, definitely check out FEMA and hazard mitigation. Next question, Peggy, any ideas if any of the new accounts will be supporting broadband programs?
The short answer is yes. There's a USDA program called Reconnect, which supports rural broadband. And so there is funding for broadband programs. The challenge is, in order to be eligible, the entity has to be in what is classified as a rural area. And the USDA has specific criteria on what constitutes a rural area and what doesn't. And so I know that the Illinois 10th District has more rural areas with our new district. So it's possible there are eligible entities, but there is that big restriction on how those funds can be used because they have to be used in a rural area. So Peggy, I hope that answers your question, but I anticipate most of the 10th District would not be eligible for that program.
All right, and we had a couple questions on that 1 year spending. If you could clarify it, basically the project timeline, even though you're asking for money only in fiscal year 2023, is a timeline eligible to be multiple years, or does it only have to be that 1 year spend?
Yeah, so you're only going to get 1 year's worth of appropriations, which is to say you're only going to get funding for that project in one bill passed for a given fiscal year. But if you spend that money over the course of several years on your end, that's fine. There are some constraints, and I can try and make sure that it's posted on our website. But the short answer is, if you use the funds over several years, that's 100% fine.
Michael asked, and you expect the bill to be signed into law around October?
Michael, I kind of laugh because we certainly hope it to be, but one of the challenges here in Congress is that there's always a lot of uncertainty around the appropriations process. And so if Congress and the House and Senate get their act together, then all of our appropriation bills should be passed by September 30th and signed into law. But unfortunately, if you look at the past 2 decades, that doesn't always happen. So the last fiscal year, the omnibus was not signed until March, about halfway through that fiscal year. And so all that is to say, that's how the process is supposed to work in terms of getting things signed before October. But if past is precedent, there's a lot of uncertainty about whether or not we'll actually follow that timeline. So sorry to give you an uncertain answer, but it's unfortunately an uncertain process.
Yeah, anytime you read in the news that we passed another continuing resolution, it means we're kicking the can down the road and that everything is just on hold.
Yeah,
which
as Greg said, there's a lot of hurry up and wait in this process, which is frustrating for you all, having already, at that point submitted your projects. But there's a lot of the legislating process that is outside of our control.
And Kevin clarified his question. My question about multi-year spending was about the proposal. Can the proposal be a multi-year one?
Yes. So a good example is the College of Lake County's workforce development program that we funded last fiscal year. We expect that to continue beyond 1 year. But we provided them with one fiscal year's worth of funding. So again, the best way to think about this, Kevin, is you're not going to get a series of funding over the course of several years. You're not going to get federal funding over a longer timeline. You're going to get one lump sum. But if you opt to use that lump sum over the course of a multi-year timeline, that's fine. So the proposal can be multi-year, but you need to know that you can only rely on a lump sum. I know that that can get a little tricky and confusing, so I'll try and post some more clarifying information on the website so that you can look back on that as a reference.
All right, and I think that's the end of the questions in the chat. If anyone wants to raise their hand and ask their question live, we've got a few more minutes left. As we wait, I'll just remind everyone, we will post these slides on our website. Again, at schneider.house.gov/appropriations. And then also we'll announce our application will go live on our website next week. And then we're going to do a follow-up webinar. We'll cover a lot of the same information, but by that time we will know the accounts. So right now we're saying hypothetically, we believe these accounts are going to be there, but next week on our conference call, we will know the actual accounts and we can address those specifically.
Peggy, to your question about the best way to get some time on the calendar to address any questions you have, just shoot me an email, shoot Greg an email, and we can carve out a couple minutes. I think I definitely encourage everyone to read the full page on our website before coming to us with questions. Our hope was to provide the answers to a lot of your questions there, but we also want to be a resource. And so feel free to shoot us an email and we can set up some time. But thanks everyone for tuning in. And I think, as I said, there's a lot of this information that we have. There's some that we don't, but as you have questions, please feel free to reach out.
Great. Thank you, Tommy. And thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks, Greg. Take care, everyone.